They forced me into a windowless coat check closet to organize the VIP gift bags, literally hiding my physical body so the country club guests wouldn't have their evening ruined by my depressing aura.
The suffocating, heavy stench of $85,000 worth of imported white orchids pressed against my skull, triggering a blinding ocular migraine that made the left side of my vision pulse with jagged white static.
My mother stood in the doorway, adjusting a diamond brooch on her custom silk gown, looking down at me with the terrifyingly calm smile of someone inspecting a problem she had completely solved.
"Darling, a real woman knows how to sacrifice for the greater aesthetic," she said, her voice dripping with artificial grace. "You were never going to pull off a classy event anyway."
I didn't blink. I just looked at the silver tray beside her, holding my discarded, moth-eaten high school prom dress. They had absolutely no idea that in exactly 14 minutes, the loaded iPad sitting inside my canvas tote bag, rammed with exactly 3 pieces of undeniable, time-stamped financial evidence, will completely vaporize her fake philanthropic empire. If you've ever had to sit entirely motionless in the dark, swallowing your own exhaustion while the woman who gave birth to you actively cannibalizes your future just to buy herself a standing ovation, tell me how you kept your hands from shaking. The sharp, deafening blast of an 18-wheeler's air horn rattled the thin plexiglass of my dispatch booth. It was 3:14 in the morning. My name is Clara. I'm 9-32, and I manage midnight freight logistics for a living. The heavy hum of the server racks constantly vibrated through the cheap linoleum floor of the control room. Basically, I watched dots on a screen for 12 hours a night, rerouting massive cargo trucks around catastrophic highway collisions while functioning on stale industrial coffee and sheer willpower. I suffer from severe, chronic insomnia. My nervous system has been so thoroughly frayed from years of hypervigilance that I constantly fall into micro-sleeps at my desk, jerking awake with my heart hammering violently against my ribs and the migraine aura already creeping into my peripheral vision. And here's the thing. My daily life outside that booth was a masterclass in severe physical friction. I wasn't just broke. I was constantly calculating my own survival. I drove a 2011 Elantra with a shattered heater core. In the dead of winter, I would literally drive home at 4 in the morning with the heat entirely turned off, shivering in my heavy work coat, just to save $14 in gas money so I could afford a basic grocery store sheet cake for my daughter's birthday. I patched the cracked rubber soles of my work boots with black industrial roofing tape. I watered down the store-brand gallon of milk every Sunday so it would stretch an extra 3 days for my 6-year-old, Maya. That was my reality. I was running pure deadhead, burning through my own biological reserves just to keep the lights on and the tires spinning. And then there was my mother. My mother was a universally beloved philanthropic gala chairwoman in our intensely wealthy suburb. She wielded local charity events the way a warlord wields a standing army. She was obsessed with optics. To the outside world, she was a tireless martyr for the community, a saint who hosted elite silent auctions for the local children's hospital and wore immaculate designer suits. Behind closed doors, the entire family dynamic was a corrupted manifest. She didn't just ignore my poverty. She viewed my financial struggle as a deliberate, personal insult to her high society aesthetic. My stepfather funded this massive illusion. He was a wealthy, entirely conflict-avoidant executive who basically bought his way out of doing any emotional labor. I remember this one specific afternoon when I brought over the mock-up for my modest wedding invitations.
My mother took one look at the cheap cardstock, sneered in absolute disgust, and aggressively tore them in half right over the granite kitchen island, claiming they looked like unrefined garbage.
My stepfather didn't defend me. He just stared at his spiked golf shoes. He muttered some pathetic excuse about how she just wants things to be perfect, and that I should let her have her moment because it was easier for everyone. Then he walked out the heavy glass patio doors to the pudding green.
My older sister was the primary attack dog. She was a bitter divorcee living in a luxury condo our mother paid for, And she secured her favored position in the hierarchy by constantly mocking my lack of refinement.
She would sit on the velvet living room couch, sipping imported wine, delivering these vicious insults disguised as sisterly concern. She told me it was so brave of me to plan a wedding on a tight budget, claiming most people would be deeply embarrassed to host something so incredibly rustic, but that I was used to settling. The only person in that sprawling, immaculate house who actually saw the rot was Eleanor, the lead event caterer. She was a tough, quiet, working-class woman who handled all my mother's extravagant parties. Eleanor never spoke out loud. She couldn't afford to lose the massive corporate contract my mother provided, but during those grueling family event setups, she would quietly slide a foil-wrapped plate of warm, expensive food into my hands when my mother wasn't looking. Just a tiny, silent nod of validation. Truth be told, there was a time I thought things could be different. I used to look at my mother pouring her second glass of Chardonnay and catch a fleeting, painful glimpse of the woman who used to sit on the carpet and help me glue dry macaroni to construction paper when I was a kid. I missed that mom. I grieved her, but she didn't exist anymore. She had been totally swallowed by the gala persona. The only thing keeping me anchored to reality was my grandfather's land. Before he passed away, my grandfather left me a modest, heavily forested plot of land on the rural edge of the county, along with his heavy, scuffed, leather-bound logbook filled with hand-drawn topography maps. It was my sanctuary. The smell of the wet pine needles and the damp earth was the only cure for my migraines. It was the only tangible asset in my life that didn't belong to the matriarch. It was the exact spot where I was going to build a tiny, peaceful cabin for me and Maya. It represented the legacy of a man who actually knew what hard work meant. A man who never faked a smile for a donor check. I fought the county zoning board for 3 brutal years to get the building permits approved. The morning the stamped paperwork finally cleared, the relief was so heavy I actually had to lean against the brick wall of the municipal building to catch my breath. I invited the whole family to a cheap local Italian restaurant to celebrate the milestone. I even bought Maya a new dress from a clearance rack for the dinner. I sat in that sticky vinyl booth with my daughter for 2 hours. Nobody came. My mother sent a text claiming there was a sudden charity emergency involving the country club's floral arrangements. My stepfather and sister predictably followed her lead, abandoning us. I sat there, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. I had to listen to my 6-year-old quietly ask why Grandma didn't want to eat pasta with us. The waitress with the chipped red nail polish kept giving me these sickening pity glances as she refilled my tap water. I ate a piece of cold garlic bread while watching my mother's live-streamed photos from a lavish cocktail mixer completely flood my phone's timeline. $85,000 worth of stolen venue deposits rerouted to buy imported orchids, while I was sitting in a cheap diner, driving with the heat off in December just to survive. That's the exact moment I learned how to turn off the emotional bleed. It's funny the things that end up destroying a carefully curated empire. It's rarely a master plan or a brilliant detective. Usually, it's just pure, sloppy arrogance. I was standing in the wide, paved driveway of my mother's house a few weeks later, right after she had casually forced me to carry her heavy dry cleaning inside the foyer. I stopped walking. I noticed a physical object dangling from the trunk latch of her pristine Mercedes SUV. It was a piece of custom-dyed silk ribbon from a highly specific, discontinued floral arrangement. I stared at the frayed edge of that ribbon fluttering in the cold wind. I dropped the dry cleaning. I walked over and pulled the ribbon free, wrapping it tightly around my freezing fingers. I didn't know it at that exact second, but that pathetic, mundane little scrap of fabric was the key that was going to expose the most massive, sickening financial felony my family had ever committed. And it was going to burn her entire social matrix straight to the ground. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was functioning on exactly 2 hours of broken sleep. My mother had summoned me to the sprawling estate for a mandatory family planning brunch. The air in the house was thick with the smell of expensive espresso and the sharp chemical tang of whatever industrial wax the cleaning service used on the Brazilian hardwood floors. I walked into the opulent foyer, my heavy work boots squeaking against the pristine wood. My mother was standing by the massive quartz kitchen island. She turned toward me, holding a heavy, opaque plastic garment bag. Her face was set in this perfectly practiced, terrifyingly gentle expression, the mask of the ultimate philanthropist. She unzipped the plastic.
The overwhelming smell of stale dust and heavy mothballs immediately hit the back of my throat.
She pulled out a yellowing, moth-eaten polyester dress. It was my high school prom dress from 14 years ago. The cheap lace was physically unraveling at the hem, and a massive, brown oxidation stain covered the entire left side of the bodice. She draped this piece of literal garbage over her arm and looked at me with pure, unadulterated fake pity. "I found this in the attic," she said, smoothing the stained fabric with her manicured hand. "Since you're struggling so much with your little event, I thought you could wear it. Vintage is very trendy for budget brides right now, Clara. A real woman knows how to sacrifice." My sister, sitting on the velvet living room sofa with a glass of Pinot Grigio, let out a short, sharp snort of laughter. My stepfather just stared aggressively at his iPad screen, completely ignoring the cruelty happening 3 feet away from him. I just stood there, staring at the unraveling thread. I didn't even have the energy to be insulted. I reached out to take the plastic bag. That was the exact second my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. Then it vibrated again, and a third time. I pulled it out. My screen was lit up with 3 consecutive automated emails from my wedding vendors. I tapped the screen. The text loaded. It read, "Final cancellation confirmation. Per the signed authorization of the primary account holder, your wedding date is voided. The remaining $85,000 in pooled venue, catering, and floral deposits has been successfully transferred to the Renewal Gala LLC." My chest went completely cold. The screen blurred. The ringing in my ears started as a low hum and spiked into a deafening screech. Gone. The entire wedding fund. Gone. $85,000. My mother had systematically drained the shared wedding account, the account holding the family's supposed generous contributions, alongside every single dollar I had saved. She hijacked the entire logistical pipeline. She voided my contracts to pay for her own vanity, renewing a vows gala.
The math hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. $85,000 for her imported string quartets and suffocating orchids, versus the 14 months I spent working double night shifts, rationing my daughter's milk, and shivering in a frozen Hyundai Elantra just to save my $8,000 portion of that deposit. She handed me a moldy piece of trash while actively robbing me of nearly $100,000.
I'm holding this plastic garment bag. The mothballs are burning my eyes. If you've ever had your own blood look you dead in the eye, smiling this warm, maternal smile, while secretly burying a knife so deep into your financial spine that you can actually feel your nervous system shutting down, tell me, how did you survive that first hour? Because right then, standing on that hardwood floor, I felt my physical body completely detach from reality. I dropped the plastic bag. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. "Where is it?" I asked. My voice didn't even sound like my own. It sounded hollow. My mother didn't blink. "Where is what, darling?" "The money. The vendor deposits. Where is the $85,000?
My stepfather physically flinched, finally looking up from his iPad. "Clara, lower your—" "You canceled my contracts," I said, stepping forward, the pulse in my neck hammering so hard it made my vision throb. "You transferred the deposits to your gala. You stole my wedding."
My sister rolled her eyes, setting her wine glass on the glass coffee table with a sharp clink. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Clara. You were in way over your head anyway. The charity board needed a bridge loan for the renewal event.
You should be thanking her for taking the pressure off. Thanking her?
My hands started to shake. I paid for the catering deposit myself. That was my overtime. That was...
Clara, enough!
My mother snapped. The maternal mask vanished instantly, replaced by a cold reptilian annoyance. But she didn't step toward me. She turned around. My 6-year-old daughter, Maya, was sitting on the expensive living room rug, building a small tower out of wooden blocks. My mother walked over, knelt down, and placed her manicured hands squarely on my daughter's tiny shoulders. She pulled Maya back against her chest. "Tell Mommy why she's being so selfish, sweetie," my mother whispered, her voice sickeningly sweet, stroking my daughter's hair while looking dead at me. "Tell her how Mommy works too much and doesn't love us enough to let Grandma save the hospital. Tell her why Mommy always ruins everything." Maya looked up at me, her little brow furrowed in utter confusion. Her bottom lip started to quiver. "Are you mad at Grandma, Mommy? Did you do something bad?" The air completely left my lungs. It was the ultimate red line, the perfect psychological hostage situation. If I screamed, if I demanded my money back, I became the unstable, screaming monster, traumatizing a child in a beautiful house. I became exactly what my mother told the neighborhood I was, and if I lost control, a woman with my mother's wealth and community standing could absolutely ruin me in family court. She held the absolute high ground, and she knew it. I looked at my stepfather. He immediately looked back down at his shoes, entirely unwilling to intervene. I was completely paralyzed. The leverage was absolute. I couldn't fight back. I had to swallow the venom, grab my confused daughter's hand, and walk out the front door in total, humiliating silence. The harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the dispatch center supply closet buzzed like an angry hornet. It was 2:14 in the morning. I was supposed to be monitoring the Eastern Seaboard logistics feed. Instead, I was sitting on the freezing concrete floor, wedged between a mop bucket and a heavy steel shelving unit stacked with industrial bleach. The biological toll finally hit. I couldn't breathe. My chest, it felt like it was physically caving in under the weight of the concrete walls. I pulled my knees to my chest and wrapped my arms around my legs, rocking back and forth. I was hyperventilating so hard my throat tasted like copper and acid. I bit down on the meat of my own hand to stifle the sound. I couldn't let the night shift supervisor hear me. I cried until my ribs physically ached. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the email confirmation. $85,000. The catering, the flowers, the venue. All of it seamlessly hijacked, and the absolute, suffocating terror was that nobody in that entire town would ever believe me. She was the gala chairwoman. I was just the exhausted, blue-collar daughter who clearly couldn't manage her finances. It was a complete manifest failure. I had nothing. I sat in that claustrophobic purgatory for 45 minutes. My phone screen lit up in the dark. A notification. I looked at it through the blur of my tears. It was my mother's public Facebook page. She had just posted a live update from a country club mixer, holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by smiling local politicians. The caption read, "So blessed to sacrifice for this beautiful community. The renewal gala will be a night to remember. #family first." I stared at the screen. I watched the likes roll in by the hundreds. And then something biologically shifted. The shaking stopped. My breathing, which had been ragged and desperate, slowed to a steady, rhythmic draw. I wiped the wet grime off my face with the rough sleeve of my work jacket. I stared at the dark concrete wall, and the panic evaporated, leaving behind a cold, terrifying clarity.
The primary dispatch junction in my chest violently seized, triggering a massive, system-wide blackout.
All the empathy, all the daughterly obligation, all the desperate yearning for a mother who would never exist. It all permanently powered down. I wasn't dealing with a family member anymore. I was looking at a catastrophic collision on the highway, and when a collision blocks the main artery, you don't sit in the wreckage and cry. You reroute the load. You systematically dismantle the blockage. You clear the road. She thought I was just a tired, stupid scapegoat. She didn't realize that managing impossible friction was literally what I did for a living. I stood up. I unlocked the closet door. The victim was dead. The hunter was awake.
The heavy, rusted metal of the country club's loading dock door slammed aggressively against the wet exterior brick.
It was 6 in the morning, and the freezing morning rain was turning the alleyway asphalt into a sheet of black ice. The air smelled intensely of rotting citrus from the dumpsters and stale exhaust fumes. I was standing by a stack of plastic milk crates, shivering in my thin work jacket. Eleanor, the lead event caterer, was leaning against the damp brick, smoking a menthol cigarette. She didn't look at me. She just reached into her heavy apron and slid a thick, tightly sealed manila envelope across the wet plastic crates. "I've worked for that woman for 12 years, Clara," Eleanor muttered, her breath pluming in the freezing air. She took a slow, heavy drag of her cigarette. "I've looked the other way on a lot of bloated vanity projects. But this, forging her own daughter's signature to hijack a vendor list, it's pure evil." I reached out and took the envelope. It felt incredibly heavy. The cold steering wheel of my Elantra dug into my palm. I was parked 3 blocks away. The heater was still broken, and I could see my own breath. I stared at the manila envelope sitting on my passenger seat. And honestly, this is where my brain completely short-circuited. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't even grip the keys to turn off the ignition. You have to understand, when you've been systematically conditioned for 30 years to believe you are the absolute root of every family problem, your body physically rejects the truth. I hovered my thumb over the metal clasp, and I froze. I heard my stepfather's dismissive voice echoing in the back of my head. "She just wants things perfect, Clara. Don't make a scene. It's easier for everyone." What if I was wrong? What if this was all some massive accounting glitch and I was just being a paranoid, jealous failure like my sister always said? I felt this sickening wave of guilt wash over me just for holding the envelope. I squeezed my eyes shut. I ripped the clasp open. I pulled out the crisp, heavy, watermarked venue contracts. The blue ink of a local notary stamp stared back at me. I turned to the second page. I read the text. "Vendor cancellation authorization, Clara Davies. All remaining liquid deposits totaling $85,000 are immediately reassigned to the Renewal Gala LLC via wire transfer." I stared at the signature line. It was a flawless, highly practiced forgery of my handwriting. The paper was undeniable, physical proof, but it wasn't enough. A single forged document could be written off by high-powered country club lawyers as a clerical error or a misunderstanding. If I was going to drop a bomb inside that closed room and guarantee absolute structural collapse, I needed to completely map the entire toxic supply chain. I needed to prove that the enablers were fully complicit. I needed to hit my sister's condo. My sister lived in a hyper-modern, high-security loft downtown. Because I was the family scapegoat, I was the one forced to keep an emergency spare key on my battered keychain to feed her purebred cat whenever she spontaneously flew to a spa retreat. I knew her schedule. I knew she had a mandated charity luncheon at noon. At 12:15 in the afternoon, I unlocked her front door. The apartment smelled intensely of expensive eucalyptus diffusers and blind entitlement. I walked straight into the open-concept kitchen. My sister owned this massive, $8,000 smart refrigerator that acted as her digital hub. She used it to dictate grocery lists, answer phone calls, and leave audio memos while drinking wine at the island. I pulled a blank USB drive from my work bag, plugged it into the hidden diagnostic port under the display screen, and bypassed the basic user interface. I have spent my entire adult life navigating raw server data to track massive freight loads across the country. Ripping simple audio files from a commercial kitchen appliance was absolute child's play. I accessed the raw storage partition. I found the time-stamped voice logs from the exact week my wedding invitations were sent out. I pressed play on my laptop. A burst of static hiss, followed by the sharp clinking of a wine glass against granite. Then, my sister's voice, unfiltered and dripping with venom, laughing with a friend on speakerphone. I literally just poured half a bottle of Merlot on Clara's master list. Who even invites these trashy people to a wedding anyway? I'm doing her a favor. I dragged the file to my USB. Then, the heavy, mechanical chime of the electronic deadbolt turning. My blood completely froze. The front door handle rattled. Heavy, expensive heels clicked against the hardwood entryway. She was home early. I was standing perfectly exposed in the middle of a massive, brightly lit kitchen island, holding an open laptop. The front door was the only exit. I had maybe 3 seconds before she rounded the corner and saw me. Pathetic paralysis seized my throat. My knees physically buckled, but I didn't hide in a pantry.
I am a midnight dispatcher.
My entire existence relies on manipulating arrival times and creating blind spots in the grid. I pulled out my phone, opened the commercial logistics app I use for freight drivers, and bypassed the building's public directory. I pinged the digital intercom panel, mounted directly inside her own entryway, spoofing a priority courier alert. A loud, automated voice blared from the wall panel 3 feet away from her. Priority delivery. Signature required immediately at the lobby concierge desk. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath. My lungs burned.
Ugh, finally, my sister groaned.
The front door opened and snapped shut. I ripped the USB from the fridge, shoved my laptop into my canvas bag, and silently slipped out the secondary service door by the trash chute. I walked down 6 flights of concrete stairs. With every single step, the terrified, stuttering heartbeat in my chest began to slow. The pathetic, gaslit daughter completely evaporated in that cold stairwell. The stutters stopped, the hesitation vanished. The entire logistical routing matrix locked into place. I had the thief. I had the attack dog. Now, I just needed the coward who funded the operation. The bright, blinding glare of a cracked iPad screen illuminated the dark interior of my parked car. It was an old first-generation family tablet my stepfather had carelessly handed down to my daughter months ago to play free games on. He was a man who threw money at problems instead of solving them, which meant he was incredibly lazy with his digital hygiene. He never bothered to wipe his synced iCloud account from the device. I sat in the freezing car, manually digging through the hidden, recently deleted audio files in the voice memo app. It was agonizingly slow. The ancient processor violently lagged, freezing every time I tapped the screen. At 8:40 in the evening, the system finally loaded. I found a recovered, unmuted voicemail he had left for my mother. I clicked play. The audio was slightly muffled, but the absolute malice and cowardice were crystal clear. I transferred the deposits to your gala account like you asked. Yes, I know it ruins her wedding, but I can't deal with your tantrums anymore. Just keep her quiet. I listened to it 3 times. He knew. He absolutely knew the profound financial devastation I was experiencing, the humiliation of losing my vendors, the raw physical panic of seeing my account drained, and he actively executed the wire transfer just so he wouldn't have to listen to his wife complain about the color of her orchids. I had the 3 pieces: the trapdoor, the character assassination, the kill shot. But downloading files was the easy part. Building an irrefutable legal guillotine required absolute, grinding bureaucratic friction. I spent the next 4 days completely submerged in administrative hell. I spent 8 cumulative hours on hold with the bank's fraud division, getting bounced between entry-level call center reps who refused to authorize a forensic IP trace. I stood in line at the county clerk's office for 3 hours in my dirty uniform scrubs, ignoring the condescending sneers of the receptionists, just to obtain the certified corporate filings for my mother's Renewal Gala LLC, to legally prove she owned the shell account receiving the stolen funds. It was a grueling, agonizing grind through corporate red tape and hold music.
But I didn't stop, because every time I felt exhausted, I just visualized the exact dollar amount printed on that forged contract. $85,000 for vanity, stolen from a woman rationing milk. The dossier was fully assembled.
The heavy, rhythmic thud of an industrial laminator echoed through the sterile front office of my daughter's elementary school. It was 10 in the morning, on a Wednesday. The air smelled intensely of cheap pine disinfectant and stale cafeteria tater tots.
I stood perfectly still at the scuffed laminate reception desk, gripping a blue ballpoint pen so tightly my knuckles were completely white. Before I could confidently walk into that bridal suite and detonate the dossier, I had to permanently disable my mother's ultimate leverage.
I had to secure the high-value cargo. As long as she had physical or legal access to my daughter, my mother held a gun to my head. I pushed the triplicate administrative forms across the desk. The school secretary, a woman wearing a pastel cardigan and a permanent, condescending smile, picked up the paperwork. Her eyes scanned the ink, and her smile instantly evaporated. She looked up at me, her brow heavily furrowed in pure confusion. She basically asked me if I had made a mistake, tapping her manicured fingernail against the line where I had explicitly crossed out my mother's name in permanent black marker. I mean, the reality of fighting a public saint is that everyone treats you like you're the one losing your mind. The secretary leaned forward and used this incredibly patronizing, hushed tone to remind me that my mother was the primary donor for the new computer lab. She actually had the audacity to suggest that revoking my mother's emergency pickup authorization might offend the school board.
I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just stared completely dead-eyed at the collar of her pastel cardigan and informed her that if she allowed that woman within 50 feet of my 6-year-old ever again, I would hold the district legally liable for child endangerment. The secretary swallowed hard, the patronizing warmth completely draining from her face, and stamped the paperwork with a heavy metallic clack. Cargo secured. My daughter was legally locked down, rerouted to an off-the-grid afternoon playdate with Eleanor the caterer's trusted teenage niece, miles away from the blast radius. But hiding Maya in the shadows wasn't enough. My mother's entire survival mechanism relied on her untouchable community status. If I just walked into that country club and started dropping paper evidence, she would instantly activate her public saint armor. She would cry. She would claim I was having a stress-induced psychotic break. The wealthy country club manager and the local journalists would immediately rally around her, usher me out the back door, and sweep the entire financial felony under the rug to protect the club's reputation. I couldn't just expose her. I had to preemptively sever the main transmission lines of her social matrix so she couldn't call for backup. I walked out to my freezing car, locked the heavy doors, and opened my laptop on the steering wheel. I tethered the awful, lagging internet connection from my phone. I wasn't going to warn the police. The police required warrants, interviews, and months of waiting. I went straight for the only thing high society actually fears: corporate liability. I navigated the clunky back end of the specific commercial insurance underwriter that insured the historic country club. Any massive event involving $85,000 of venue liability required an active zero-fraud indemnity clause. I pulled up the corporate fraud reporting portal. The screen glared aggressively in the dim light of the overcast morning.
Look, doing this in the dark, knowing you are actively initiating the legal destruction of your own mother, requires a level of paranoia that physically eats your stomach lining. Every single time a car drove past my parked Elantra, my heart seized, convinced it was her pulling up to the school to confront me. I was sweating through my uniform shirt despite the freezing temperature in the cabin.
I uploaded the high-resolution scans of the forged vendor contracts. I attached the audio file of my stepfather admitting to the fraudulent wire transfer. I typed out the official digital submission text.
Formal notice of liability. The Renewal Gala LLC event, scheduled for this evening, is funded entirely via wire fraud and forged signatures. Associated documentation attached. Continuing to host this event constitutes active corporate complicity in a federal financial crime. I clicked submit. The loading bar appeared. It crawled to 40%, then it froze. The little blue circle just spun and spun. I sat there in the freezing car, staring at the blinking cursor, totally paralyzed by the agonizing friction of a cheap cell phone network. The minutes dragged into an unbearable eternity. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my forearms cramped, waiting for the system to either time out or deliver the lethal blow.
Finally! A sharp digital chime broke the silence.
The screen flashed green. A confirmation number appeared. It was done. The insurance underwriter would immediately flag the event, sending an automated, terrifying red alert directly to the country club's general manager just hours before the doors opened. I had successfully quarantined the entire environment. When the trap finally sprang, the club wouldn't protect her. They would view her as a massive, radioactive financial liability and drop her instantly. The leverage was completely neutralized. Now, I just needed to secure my invitation to the slaughter. The harsh, metallic buzz of my cell phone vibrating against the cheap plastic console of my Elantra shattered the silence of the parking lot. It was 1 p.m. I had just finished the insurance submission. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Aunt Sarah, my stepfather's sister, and the only extended family member who had ever shown me a shred of decency. I picked up, expecting maybe a sliver of comfort about the canceled wedding. Instead, her voice was strained, pitying. She didn't ask how I was doing. She just sighed and launched into this suffocating wave of weaponized therapy speak. She told me my mother had called her in tears that morning. My mother had explicitly warned the entire extended family that the wedding cancellation had triggered a severe psychotic break in me. My mother claimed I was hallucinating, that I was financially unstable, and that they were staging a beautiful intervention at the gala to get me the clinical help I so desperately needed. I sat there in the freezing car, listening to Aunt Sarah gently suggest I check into a facility, and the sheer, terrifying brilliance of my mother's sabotage hit me.
She wasn't just stealing the money. She was completely jamming the comms.
She was preemptively isolating me from every single external ally, establishing a flawless narrative quarantine.
By the time I tried to tell the truth, I would just look like the raving, unstable daughter she had warned everyone about. I hung up the phone. Honestly, acting nice was harder than the actual planning of this trap.
If I wanted to get inside that highly secure country club tonight, I had to fully embrace the exact pathetic caricature she had painted.
I had to become the broken scapegoat.
I had to operate totally off the grid, swallowing every instinct to defend myself.
I texted my mother. I'm so sorry. You're right. I'm struggling. Can I come early and help you set up the suite?
The reply was instantaneous. Of course, darling. A little hard work will ground you.
The overwhelming, sickly sweet stench of $85,000 worth of imported white orchids flooded my lungs the exact second I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite.
It was 4:30 in the afternoon. The historic country club was buzzing with aggressive, high society prep. The suite was lined with crushed velvet chairs and gilded mirrors. My mother was sitting perfectly straight in the center of the room, wearing a custom silk robe, while a makeup artist meticulously powdered her cheekbones. I walked in wearing my faded dispatch uniform, holding a cheap plastic water bottle. I looked like absolute trash. I looked exactly how she wanted me to look. Defeated, exhausted, and utterly subservient.
She dismissed the makeup artist with a wave of her manicured hand. She didn't look at my face. She simply pointed down at her feet. She was wearing a pair of $1,200 Jimmy Choo heels, and there was a microscopic, barely visible scuff mark near the toe of the left shoe. She handed me a damp cloth.
I sank to my knees on the hardwood floor. I pressed the damp rag against the expensive leather, aggressively scrubbing at a smudge that didn't even matter. My knees were aching against the hardwood, and while I was literally hunched over her feet, she took a long, slow sip of her complimentary champagne and started complaining.
She didn't ask about my canceled wedding. She complained about the absolute burden of leadership. She sighed heavily, talking about how exhausting it was to carry the philanthropic weight of the entire community on her shoulders, and how the country club's catering staff was just so appallingly incompetent.
I want you to pause right here and really visualize this. You are on your hands and knees on a freezing hardwood floor. You are physically scrubbing the dirt off the shoe of the woman who just stole nearly $100,000 of your survival money, listening to her whine about the exhausting burden of being rich. Could you swallow that? Do you have the cold, sociopathic restraint to stay perfectly silent on that floor and play the long game? Or would you have snapped and put her through that gilded mirror?
I didn't snap. I just kept scrubbing.
I kept my head down, staring at the floorboards, matching the rhythmic circle of the rag to my breathing. There, I mumbled, my voice perfectly hollow. It's clean.
Thank you, Clara, she said, not even glancing down. Now go stand in the coat check room and organize the VIP gift bags.
I can't have the journalists seeing you looking so ragged when they arrive for the pre-interviews. I nodded submissively. I stood up. My legs felt like lead. I picked up my battered, faded canvas tote bag from the floor. It was a cheap bag, frayed at the heavy straps, stained from years of sitting on the floor of a freight dispatch booth. It looked completely harmless. It looked like the kind of bag a broken, minimum-wage failure carries around to hold their extra work boots. But inside that canvas, tucked beneath a stained sweater, was the arsenal. I had meticulously organized the physical documents into pristine, transparent sleeves, sliding them securely into the front pocket of my heavy iPad case. The iPad itself was fully charged, the screen brightness locked to maximum, the audio files queued up and ready to broadcast.
I wasn't waiting for a lawyer to show up. I wasn't coordinating with the police outside. I was bringing the absolute destruction directly into the center of her fortress, completely unarmed on the outside, and carrying a fully loaded digital guillotine on the inside. I walked into the windowless coat check closet and shut the heavy door behind me. I stood in the dark, surrounded by expensive wool coats, gripping the frayed handles of my tote bag. The trap was set. The doors were about to open. The ghost fleet had successfully breached the perimeter, and she didn't even know she was already sinking. The sharp, high-pitched whine of a camera flash capacitor charging pierced the heavy, suffocating air of the bridal suite. It was 6:45 in the evening, exactly 15 minutes before the massive, gilded doors of the main ballroom were scheduled to swing open for the renewal gala. My mother had finally let me out of the coat check closet, explicitly ordering me to stand in the far back corner of the suite. She wanted me completely isolated by the heavy velvet drapes, practically hidden behind a towering pillar of stolen white orchids. The room was an absolute pressure cooker. I mean, it was suffocatingly packed. There were local lifestyle journalists, high society sycophants, and a small army of bridesmaids wearing matching champagne-colored silk. The heat in the room was unbearable from all the bodies and the aggressively bright vanity lights. But the worst part, the thing that was actively grinding my nerves into dust, was the ambient noise. It wasn't just the overlapping, fake aristocratic chatter. It was the low, rhythmic, heavy thud of the string quartet actively tuning their cellos in the adjacent ballroom. The deep bass notes were literally vibrating through the historic hardwood floorboards, traveling straight up through the soles of my work boots like a physical countdown clock. I just stood there in the corner, gripping the frayed handles of my canvas tote bag. My faded dispatch uniform stuck out like an open wound against the crushed velvet furniture. My sister was holding court on the main sofa, sipping from a crystal flute of $800 champagne. She was surrounded by 3 of my mother's wealthiest charity board members. And of course, she couldn't resist the opportunity.
She thrives on an audience. She caught me looking at the massive floral arrangements. She didn't even bother to lower her voice. She just leaned forward, swirling the champagne, and delivered this vicious, performative smile. You know, Clara, we were just talking about your situation. She paused, making sure the women next to her were completely silent and listening. Honestly, it's so brave of you to try and have a wedding on a budget. I mean, most people in this zip code would be deeply embarrassed to host something so entirely rustic. But you've always been so good at making do with less. The board members let out this forced, polite, overlapping laughter. I didn't react. I didn't say a word. I just stared at her. The old me, the broken, gaslit daughter, would have flushed red, felt the pathetic paralysis grip my throat, and apologized for existing. But the old me was dead. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a dispatcher executing the final routing of an unavoidable collision. I was standing at the terminal checkpoint, and I knew exactly what was inside my bag. I felt the heavy, rigid, rectangular shape of the loaded iPad pressing against the canvas fabric, and it kept my heart rate completely flat. My mother was stationed at the massive, gilded makeup vanity in the center of the suite. She was the absolute sovereign of this little kingdom. A local reporter was literally kneeling next to her on the rug, holding a digital recorder, asking fawning questions about the burden of philanthropy. My mother was soaking it in. She was complaining beautifully about how utterly exhausting it was to carry the community's needs, completely oblivious to the impending doom. She stood up from the vanity chair. The room instantly hushed. She was wearing this breathtaking, custom-tailored silk gown, and right there, on the edge of the mahogany table, sat the silver tray holding the moth-eaten prom dress she had handed me days ago. She had literally put it on display in the suite, a silent, psychological weapon to keep me in my place and show the journalists how charitable she was to her struggling daughter. As she adjusted the plunging neckline of her dress, the heavy oak door to the suite cracked open. Eleanor, the lead caterer, slipped into the room carrying a fresh tray of hors d'oeuvres. She looked physically exhausted, her black uniform stained from the kitchen. Eleanor walked past the sycophants, completely ignored by the wealthy elite, and moved toward the back corner where I was standing. She didn't say a word, but as she placed the tray on the side table next to me, she deliberately bumped a crystal glass of ice water toward the very edge of the wood, right within my reach. She stopped, looked me dead in the eye for 1 microsecond, and gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It was a micro-kindness, a silent acknowledgement that she knew exactly what I was enduring. I looked at the water. I looked at Eleanor walking away, and a sickening wave of guilt washed over me. I knew that when I detonated the room in about 3 minutes, Eleanor's catering contract for the evening was going to vaporize. But the payload was already armed, and the sequence couldn't be aborted. My mother turned away from the mirror. She held a massive, glittering diamond brooch in her manicured fingers. The journalists aimed their cameras. She looked across the crowded room, her eyes locking onto me standing in the shadows with my dirty work bag. The room fell completely silent, waiting for her to speak.
She looked at me, her face completely devoid of actual maternal warmth, and delivered the final, hypocritical strike with terrifying calmness. "Darling," she said, her voice echoing slightly against the high plaster ceiling. "A real woman knows how to sacrifice for the greater aesthetic. You were never going to pull off a classy event anyway."
The journalist nodded sympathetically. The sister smirked. The sycophants looked at me with absolute sickening pity. I didn't blink. I just looked at her raising the diamond brooch to her chest. And I want you to really look at her. Look at the $1,200 shoes, the imported orchids, the adoring reporters taking notes on her fake martyrdom. I just stared at her, standing at the absolute peak of her stolen mountain, and I wondered if she had any idea how fast a fake empire burns when you cut the oxygen, because I was about to find out. I didn't blink. I reached into my faded canvas tote bag, My fingers gripped the cold aluminum edge of the iPad and the thick, heavy plastic of the document sleeves. I pulled them out. I didn't yell. I didn't say a single word. I just walked directly across the Persian rug. The local journalists parted slightly, confused by the dirty dispatch uniform moving into the center of the frame. I reached the mahogany makeup vanity. I shoved the silver tray holding that pathetic prom dress out of the way. It scraped against the wood with a harsh, grating screech. I set the loaded iPad down on the table. I tapped the screen. The volume was locked to maximum. The sharp, digital hiss of the smart fridge recording cut through the suffocating air of the suite. Then, my sister's voice echoed off the plaster ceiling, unfiltered, cruel.
I literally just poured half a bottle of Merlot on Clara's master list. Who even invites these trashy people to a wedding anyway? I'm doing her a favor.
I pressed pause. Silence. Total silence. The room stopped breathing. I looked at my sister.
She was sitting on the velvet sofa, holding her crystal flute of champagne halfway to her mouth. She froze. The smug, performative smile completely vanished from her face. Look, when a bully loses their cover in front of the exact people they want to impress, they don't fight. They crumble.
The three wealthy charity board members sitting next to her physically recoiled. One of them actually slid down the sofa, creating a distinct 2-foot gap between herself and my sister, treating her like a contagious disease. My sister's mouth opened, but she just stuttered. She tried to laugh it off, her voice shaking. That's out of context. Nobody listened. The charity board members just stared at her in absolute disgust. The toxic alliance was instantly, violently fractured. I didn't look at her for more than 2 seconds. I swiped the iPad screen. I tapped the second audio file. The heavy, exhausted voice of my stepfather filled the suite. He was standing near the heavy oak doors holding his own phone, waiting for the gala to start. I transferred the deposits to your gala account like you asked. Yes, I know it ruins her wedding, but I can't deal with your tantrums anymore. Just keep her quiet. I pressed pause again. The journalists immediately raised their digital recorders.
The camera flashes stopped. The atmosphere in the room plummeted to freezing. My stepfather physically shrank. The blood completely drained from his face. He didn't try to defend my mother. He didn't try to explain the financial transfer to the room. His entire cowardice was laid bare in front of the high society friends he golfed with. He let out a choked gasp, backed slowly into the shadowy hallway, and literally hid behind the doorframe. And then, the room broke.
Eleanor, the lead caterer, was standing by the side table. She had spent 12 years watching this woman abuse the staff, steal resources, and systematically destroy her own daughter. Eleanor had reached her absolute limit. She didn't yell.
She didn't scream. She executed the coldest affection I have ever witnessed.
Eleanor reached into her black apron. She pulled out her official, leather-bound catering ledger and a folded stack of printed email logs.
She walked directly into the center of the room, her heavy, rubber-soled kitchen shoes squeaking against the floorboards. She stopped next to the vanity. She slammed the heavy ledger down right next to my iPad. "I'm the lead vendor," Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, loud, and uncompromising. "I saw the original wire transfer request. I saw the routing numbers. The money for the imported orchids came directly from the voided wedding account. It came from her." Eleanor turned her back on my mother. She walked around the table and stood directly next to me.
"I'm with her," Eleanor said. My mother's face twisted into absolute panic. The public saint mask was cracking. She looked at Eleanor, then at the journalists, and tried to deploy her ultimate desperate weapon. "This Scan Zero is a psychotic break," my mother stammered, her voice high and erratic, pointing a manicured finger at me. "My daughter is unwell. She fabricated this. It's a lie." I didn't argue. I reached into the thick plastic sleeve. I pulled out the physical documents. I want you to understand the sheer, undeniable weight of bureaucratic paper. You can argue with an audio clip, you can try to discredit a disgruntled caterer, but you cannot argue with a certified federal bank record. I pulled out the notarized vendor cancellation contracts, the thick, watermarked paper, the heavy blue ink of the notary stamp, the crisp red seal of the county clerk's office on the attached LLC corporate filings. I stepped forward. I slapped the thick stack of legal documents onto the mahogany vanity, right next to her $1,200 makeup brushes. Certified vendor cancellation authorization, I said. My voice was completely dead, clinical, bearing a forged signature, documenting the illegal transfer of $85,000 into a shell corporation registered under your name. The corporate fraud division of your event underwriter received these exact high-resolution scans an hour ago. The event insurance is completely void. I slid the documents across the polished wood. They stopped an inch from her hands. The physical ruin was profound. The local journalists didn't ask a single follow-up question. They immediately stepped backward, pulling out their phones, rapidly typing. The story had just violently shifted from a boring lifestyle piece to a front-page financial crime. My mother experienced absolute biological shock. She didn't scream. She didn't throw a glass in slow motion. She froze. The paralyzing terror locked her joints. Her knees physically buckled under the weight of the custom silk gown. She had to grip the edge of the mahogany table just to stay upright. The blood completely drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow, terrified, and ancient. She began sweating profusely. I could see the dark patches forming under the silk at her collar. Her eyes darted erratically, but she couldn't look at the crowd. She micro-fixated on the documents on the table. She just stared blankly at the bright blue ink of the notary stamp. Her mouth moved, desperately trying to form a syllable, trying to reject the undeniable reality, but her throat was completely seized. And then came the cold social collapse. High society elites do not tolerate liability. They do not stick around for federal fraud investigations. The 3 charity board members stood up. They set their crystal champagne flutes down on the glass coffee table with a sharp clink. They didn't say a word to my sister. They didn't look at my mother. They just turned around and walked out the heavy oak doors. The bridesmaids followed, then the sycophants, then the journalists. The only sound in the room was the heavy, rhythmic thud of the string quartet playing in the empty ballroom next door, and the squeak of expensive leather shoes rapidly retreating down the hallway. Nobody ran. Nobody yelled. They just left her. Within 60 seconds, the crowded, suffocating bridal suite was completely empty, save for me, Eleanor, and a terrified woman gripping a table to keep from collapsing on the floor. She was completely isolated in her stolen dress. Her entire social matrix, built meticulously over 3 decades, evaporated into thin air. I looked at the silver tray holding my ruined prom dress. Then I looked at her. You loved running charities. Enjoy becoming a charity case. My mother's phone, sitting on the mahogany vanity, lit up. A sharp, generic digital chime. Then another, and another. Within 5 seconds, the phone was violently vibrating against the wood in a continuous, erratic spasm. The local journalists had already reached the lobby. The audio files were already live. The push notifications were flooding in. She stared at the screen, and the absolute reality of her situation finally breached the hull. The paralyzing shock broke, instantly replaced by the terrifying, frantic desperation of a cornered animal. Her public mask completely shattered. She lunged forward. Her manicured hands grabbed the rough, faded fabric of my work uniform sleeve. Her grip was insanely tight, her acrylic nails digging into my forearm. She completely abandoned the elegant, aristocratic posture she had practiced for 3 decades.
I gave you life!
She begged, her voice cracking into this raw, pathetic screech. The $1,200 dress dragged across the floorboards. You owe me this one night! I'm an old woman, Clara! Please! Don't humiliate me in front of the senator! I looked down at her hands gripping my sleeve. I felt exactly nothing. No anger, no pity. The logistics grid was permanently offline. I didn't try to pull away. I didn't yell. I just stared at her with absolute, clinical detachment. The heavy oak doors of the suite swung open. The country club's general manager burst into the room. He was a stiff, deeply serious man in a tailored suit, but right now, his face was flushed red, and he was sweating heavily. He held his own cell phone, staring at the flashing red corporate alert from the insurance underwriter I had triggered an hour ago. I calmly reached forward and pulled my loaded iPad off the vanity. I picked up the thick stack of physical, notarized vendor contracts. I turned my back on my mother. I walked directly over to the manager and handed him the heavy stack of paper. "The insurance is void," I stated, my voice dead flat. "The event is entirely funded by wire fraud. If you open those ballroom doors, you are an accessory." The manager looked at the blue notary stamps. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked past me to my mother, who was still kneeling on the rug.
He didn't offer her a shred of sympathy. He treated her like a biohazard. He coldly informed her that the police had been notified of the insurance breach and that she had exactly 10 minutes to vacate the property before she was physically removed for trespassing.
I adjusted the strap of my canvas tote bag on my shoulder, walked out the heavy oak doors, and left her on the floor. The sharp, hissing sizzle of a greasy hamburger patty hitting a flat-top grill filled the cramped diner. It was 3 days later. It was 11 in the morning, and it was pouring rain. You see, narcissists never actually believe the game is over. Even when the engine is completely seized, they still try to turn the key. My mother had used her very last shred of unfrozen cellular data to text me, demanding a meeting at a cheap diner on 4th Street, threatening to file corporate espionage charges against my dispatching license if I didn't show up. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth. The air smelled intensely of stale coffee and fryer oil. She walked in. She looked completely unrecognizable. The custom silk was gone, replaced by a wrinkled trench coat. Her hair was flat, but the sheer arrogance was still desperately clinging to her bones. She slid into the booth across from me. She didn't order anything. She just reached into her coat and slapped a single, crumpled piece of paper onto the sticky table.
Sign it,
She demanded, her voice shaking with forced authority. "It's a non-disclosure agreement. You sign this, you publicly retract the audio, and I won't ruin your pathetic little career." I looked at the paper. It was a generic legal template she had clearly printed at a public library. I mean,
It was just sad.
"Look at me," she hissed, leaning over the table. "I still know the district attorney. I still have leverage. You are going to fix this, Clara, right now." I didn't touch the paper. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I set it face up on the sticky table.
I forwarded your text message to the state licensing board and the federal fraud investigator 30 minutes ago.
I said calmly. Attempting to extort a witness with a fraudulent NDA during an active federal investigation upgrades your civil penalty to a felony count of witness tampering.
The investigator is literally waiting outside in an unmarked car right now to see if you actually handed me the document.
Her eyes darted to the rain-streaked window. A black sedan was idling by the curb. The remaining air completely left her lungs. The fake authority evaporated.
"The bill for the coffee is yours," I said. I slid out of the booth and walked into the rain. The aggressive, artificial hum of a fluorescent department store light practically vibrated against the cheap mirrored walls. Because I detonated the entire ecosystem, the fallout wasn't limited to the matriarch. The secondary targets violently cannibalized each other. The second the police froze the shell accounts, my sister's luxury condo payments bounced. The mother she had aggressively defended instantly threw her under the bus, telling the auditors that my sister was the one who managed the books. My sister lost the condo in 48 hours. I walked past a high-end cosmetic counter in the local mall 2 weeks later. I stopped. My sister was standing behind the glass display case. She was wearing a stiff, humiliatingly cheap polyester uniform. She was holding a makeup brush, and she was physically shaking. Sitting in the client chair across from her was one of the exact wealthy charity board members she used to gossip with in the bridal suite. The board member wasn't making eye contact. She was treating my sister like invisible, lower-class hired help, demanding she blend the foundation faster.
My sister, the woman who had mocked my rustic wedding and my lack of refinement, was now making minimum wage, forced to physically touch the faces of the elite women who had entirely excommunicated her. I watched her swallow her pride, her eyes red and puffy, as she subserviently applied the blush. I didn't even smile. I just kept walking. The heavy, metallic thwack of a golf club hitting a ball echoed across the manicured green. My stepfather thought his money would insulate him. He thought he could just distance himself from the fraud and maintain his pristine country club status. But high society operates on absolute ruthlessness. He walked into the country club grill room on a Saturday morning, wearing his expensive spiked shoes, expecting to sit at his usual table with his CEO buddies. I heard the story from Eleanor. The entire table of men stopped talking. They didn't yell at him. They didn't ask him to leave. They simply stood up in total unison, picked up their scotch glasses, and relocated to the patio, leaving him completely alone at a table for 6. He was a ghost, a total social pariah. He returned to his massive, echoing mansion, completely abandoned by his wife, his friends, and his fake prestige. But the most profound visual ruin belonged to my mother. The legal dismantling was absolute. The state auditors seized everything. I drove past her massive, gated estate one evening on my way to a dispatch shift. It was a graveyard. 2 heavy industrial tow trucks were parked in the driveway. The drivers were wrapping thick steel chains around the axles of her pristine Mercedes SUV. Plastered across the heavy, custom-carved wooden front doors of the mansion were 3 bright, neon orange federal seizure notices. The house was completely dark. The bank had already cut the power. She was forced to liquidate the remaining hidden assets just to stay out of a federal penitentiary. She moved into a bleak, anonymous, beige condo complex on the industrial side of the county. And that is where the final, pathetic reality of the hollow cage set in. She had spent 30 years wielding money as a weapon, forcing me to handle every single granular logistical detail of her life. She had no idea how the actual world functioned without a scapegoat to buffer the friction. A month later, Eleanor texted me a photo she had taken from a strip mall parking lot. It was my mother. She was standing inside a grim, fluorescent-lit public laundromat. She was wearing a faded pair of sweatpants, holding a plastic basket of dirty clothes. She was standing in front of a massive, coin-operated washing machine. She was crying. She wasn't crying because of the fraud, or the lost orchids, or the ruined gala. She was sobbing, genuine, heavy tears, because she literally did not know how to insert the quarters into the machine. She didn't know how to measure the cheap powdered detergent. Her entire life had been an empty manifest, completely dependent on the labor of the daughter she hated. She was 60-something years old, standing in a puddle of dirty water on a linoleum floor, completely and utterly helpless. The empire was dead. The heavy, sliding glass doors of the downtown legal arbitration office clicked shut. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a month after the gala imploded. My stepfather sat across from me at a sterile, glass-topped conference table. He looked absolutely hollowed out. The deep tan he maintained on the country club golf course had faded into a sickly, gray pallor. His expensive, tailored suit hung loosely on his shoulders. He didn't make eye contact. He just stared at his own reflection in the glass, reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, and slid a heavy, watermarked cashier's check across the table. I glanced at the numbers. It was massive, 6 figures. He was a wealthy man who had completely surrendered his core identity decades ago. He wasn't some calculated, evil mastermind manipulating the shadows. He was just a deeply broken, exhausted old man who was deathly afraid of conflict. He had spent 30 years substituting his checkbook for actual fatherhood because paying for the abuse was always easier than standing up to it. "Clara, please," he muttered, his voice cracking, still staring at the glass table. I just want to make this go away. Take the money. We can start over." I looked at the check. I didn't scream. I didn't yell at him for abandoning me and my daughter at that cheap Italian diner. I just sat there. I felt my shoulders physically drop. One single heavy tear escaped my left eye, cutting a cold path down my cheek, quietly grieving the father figure I never actually had. The bond was completely, unequivocally dead. I placed my index finger on the edge of the paper check. I slid it slowly back across the glass until it bumped against his knuckles. "You funded a felony to avoid an argument," I said, my voice perfectly flat. "You can't afford to buy your way out of this one." He flinched, shrinking back into his leather chair. I stood up, zipped my canvas bag, and walked out of the office, leaving the check on the table. The ledger was already closed anyway. I didn't need his hush money. My attorney had been utterly ruthless. The civil judgment was brutally swift. The court ordered an aggressive, total clawback from my mother's frozen LLC. The entire $85,000 in stolen vendor deposits, plus massive punitive damages for the emotional distress and fraud, was forcefully liquidated from her remaining assets and wired directly back into my name. We didn't try to recreate the local wedding.
We used a fraction of that recovered money to fund a spectacular, entirely private destination wedding on a quiet beach, thousands of miles away from the suffocating orchids and the country club elite. The sharp, synthetic ping of a text message echoed in the empty front seat of my Elantra.
I had just parked outside the hardware store. I looked at the glowing screen. It was an unsaved number, but I recognized the frantic, desperate tone immediately. It was my sister. "Clara, they're evicting me on Friday. Mom won't answer her phone. I have nowhere to go. We're still family, right? Please." I stared at the text bubble. I remembered her sitting on the velvet sofa, laughing about pouring wine on my wedding invitations. I pressed delete. Then, I opened my settings and tapped block caller. I systematically went through my contacts, deleting her, my mother, my stepfather, and every single flying monkey who had ever looked down on me. I erased decades of digital history. The satisfaction of watching their names disappear from my digital existence was a gritty, heavy relief. The digital quarantine was absolute. The sharp, clean scent of damp pine needles and fresh-cut cedar filled my lungs. It was a Sunday afternoon. There was no suffocating smell of imported flowers. There was no forced, aristocratic laughter vibrating through the floorboards. There was only the vast, beautiful, sprawling silence of the rural county line. I was sitting on the raw wooden steps of the newly framed cabin on my grandfather's land. The construction was simple, sturdy, and entirely paid for. The final logistics manifest was permanently cleared. Maya was sitting next to me on the porch, wearing a pair of dirty denim overalls, happily digging in the soil with a small plastic trowel. I smiled. I reached into my faded canvas tote bag and pulled out my grandfather's heavy, scuffed, leather-bound topography logbook. I rested the book on my knees. I ran my thumb slowly over the deep, worn scratches in the dark leather. I felt the rigid, heavy spine of the book. As my fingers traced the physical indentations left by his hard work, a profound, overwhelming sense of peace washed over me. The terrifying, blinding ocular migraines that had haunted my nights for years were completely, permanently gone. My grandfather had left me this sanctuary because he knew exactly what I was capable of. He knew the matriarch would try to consume me, and he left me the exact anchor I needed to survive the storm. As I smelled the damp earth and listened to the quiet wind moving through the massive pine trees, I realized the ultimate victory wasn't destroying my mother's fake empire. The victory was sitting on this porch, breathing clean air, and knowing I possessed the exact same quiet, unbreakable strength my grandfather always saw in me. I was completely safe.